Hey, welcome students to Political Science 370, Social Science Research Methods. Today we will be going over an article selected by Savannah Gabris, and it is titled Economic Outlook and the Gender Gap in Attitudes About Climate Change. All right, so Michael, do a lot of people think that if we take steps to reduce climate change, it will negatively impact the economy?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that perception out there. So who do you think will be most likely to oppose climate change measures? Those who think the economy is doing well, or those who think the economy is doing poorly?
Those who think it's doing poorly.
Yeah, those are kind of more economically vulnerable, right? So they basically say that economic outlook is going to have an effect on your views of climate change and whether or not you support specific climate change policies, right? So they also say that gender has been found to have an effect on climate change.
Interesting.
Yeah, who do you think supports reducing carbon dioxide emissions more, men or women?
Women?
Women. Now, why would you say that?
I don't know, just because they tend to be more liberal,
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, more women than men identify as liberal and identify with the Democratic Party, true. Yeah. But say we control for those things, and still find that women are more likely than men to support certain climate change policies. What would be the explanation?
I don't
Yeah, I don't know exactly. This is kind of where socialization theories come in.
Okay.
That men, from a young age, are socialized into being more aggressive. They're told that they need to be providers. Those types of things, where women are socialized into being more nurturing.
Yeah.
Those types of things. So, those are explanations that are kind of rooted in sociology, right?
Yeah.
So the interesting thing about this article is, it was, like I say, it was selected by Savannah, who is an environmental studies major.
Okay.
And this article kind of brings together three disciplines: environmental studies, sociology, and political science, because we're going to look at surveys that look at support for particular policies. So this is kind of an interesting paper, right?
Yeah.
It draws heavily on three different disciplines. Okay, so the article says this study advances earlier research by first taking a closer look at the relationship between economic outlook and support for environmental policies. They're going to look at support for specific environmental policies. Then by testing for interaction effects to examine the role gender plays in this relationship. Interaction between gender and your socioeconomic status.
Okay.
Well, not your socioeconomic status, your perceptions of the economy.
Oh.
Yeah. We do this by testing two hypotheses. First, we hypothesize that support for environmental policies is conditioned on economic outlook. So, in theory, while we're still in the conceptualization stage here,
Yeah.
we're going to have support for environmental policies. Low to high. So, support for environmental policies, is that going to be our independent variable or our dependent variable?
Dependent.
Dependent variable, exactly. And they're going to hypothesize that support for environmental policies is conditioned on economic outlook. Economic outlook. Low to high, or negative to positive, right? But that's basically their first hypothesis, right? So as someone's economic outlook increases, what happens to their support for environmental policies?
Increases.
Increases, right? So there should be positive association between these two variables, right?
Yeah.
Okay, exactly. Second, well, let me state further. People who feel better about the economy or their personal finances are more likely to support policies that address climate change. Right? Second, we hypothesize that men are more likely to condition environmental policy support on economic assessments, and the gender gap will be most prevalent among those who are most pessimistic about the national economy and their personal financial situation. So they're making the argument that in general, women support more environmental policies than men, but this is particularly acute when your economic outlook is really poor, right? That's when there's going to be a big gap between men and women, right? Because the idea is, again, men are socialized to maybe provide for their families, do whatever's necessary, and if they feel economically threatened, then they're not going to support these policies.
Okay.
Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we have to get into how they went about testing their hypotheses. The first thing is the data set they used. The data set they used was called the 2016 Cooperative Congressional Election Survey. The 2016 Cooperative Congressional Election Survey, known as the CCES. It is a national representative survey with a sample of 64,600 people. Is that a large sample size? Huge, yes. So 64,000. So our estimate's going to be pretty accurate.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, Savannah pointed out in her research, valid critique of the data set here is that it was all gathered online.
Oh.
Yeah. And so it was intended to be national. It was intended to be representative. But because it was gathered online, you're going to be excluding people that don't have computers or other ways of answering it online. So there's a possibility that it's a little biased, right? Okay. But as far as data sets go, pretty darn good one. right? And the sample size, 64,600, is outstanding. Then they're going to perform a set of logistic regression analyses. So logistic regression analyses. So what type of dependent variable are we going to have?
Dichotomous.
A dichotomous dependent variable. Exactly. So, like I say, it always helps to draw a picture. Shows you understand things, right?
Yeah.
And they're going to ask people 4 questions.
Ooh.
Right? So they're going to have four different models because they have 4 different dependent variables. And remember, you can only run multivariate regression analyses on one dependent variable at a time, right?
Yeah.
So the first way they operationalize environmental policies. Well, Michael, what environmental policies would you come up with? Remember, this was their original hypothesis. As economic outlook increases, support for environmental policies increases. How would you operationalize support for environmental policies?
Ooh. I guess I'd just ask them how much they support.
Okay, yeah. Cut right to the chase. Well, your test number 2 talked about the advantages and disadvantages of secondary data analysis, right?
Yeah.
So, they didn't design the data set, did they?
No.
No, they didn't. But fortunately, there were a number of questions about certain policies that were in the data set. One was, do you support EPA regulation of CO2?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Support EPA regulation of CO2. Carbon dioxide. So there it is on our dependent variable. Do you support EPA regulation of CO2? Coded 1 if the person answered yes, 0 if they answered no. Then they had economic outlook down here with the independent variables. And people were asked about how the economy was doing, right? Economic outlook. So, here, let me find it really quickly. I want to give it to you. Well, they were basically... Oh, here it is. Okay. One measures perceptions about the national economy and is posed through 2 questions asking for retrospective and prospective assessments of the national economy. Specifically, respondents were asked for perceptions of whether the national economy had gotten much better or worse in the previous year and whether it will get better or worse over the next year. Retrospective, did it get better or worse the previous year? Prospective, do I think it'll get better or worse in the upcoming year?
Oh.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Both variables are coded on a 6-point scale ranging from 0, which represents gotten much worse at the low end, to 5, gotten much better at the high end. Right?
Okay.
So got it? Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a 5-point scale. So, next thing before so basically, just is going to be economic outlook, low to high, and the relationship there. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And the hypothesis is as it goes from low to high, your support for EPA regulations of CO2 should go up. Alright? Okay. Now let's stick with the CO2 model before we go to other models here. Okay. Researchers have to make a number of decisions whenever they're doing their research, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about what a coefficient estimate means in OLS, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's an OLS coefficient estimate mean?
The predicted shift in Y from one unit shift in the relevant X holding all other variables constant. Yeah.
Outstanding, right? In logit or probit, usually, what is the coefficient estimate mean?
The shift in the probability that Y equals 1 from a shift in the X. Yeah.
X, right.
Yeah,
and we've discussed it.
Greatest shift in probability.
Right. Yeah, we've discussed. You have to take pretty advanced statistical courses to figure out exactly what it means, but it's the predicted shift in Y from a shift in the relevant X. No, it's a predicted shift in the probability that Y equals 1.
Yeah.
Right? From a shift in the relevant X. Holding all other variables constant at values which yield a z-score of 0. Or in other words...
Okay.
Yeah. So in other words, at that point of maximum impact.
Yeah.
Right?
The inflection point.
Yeah. Yeah, that point of maximum impact, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so these researchers chose to do things a different way. They chose to present the odds ratio, right? Okay. And when you present odds ratios, what you're saying basically is if I get an odds ratio of 1, this variable is having no effect on the dependent variable.
Okay.
Right? There's just no relationship there. Right?
Mm-hmm.
When you get an odds ratio that is statistically significant and it's higher than 1, then we're pretty sure that this variable increases the probability that the person will answer yes to the question. Or that Y will equal 1.
Okay.
When you get an odds ratio that is statistically significantly lower than 1, then that variable reduces the probability that Y will equal 1. Make sense?
Yeah.
So we're not looking for positive and negative coefficient estimates here like we usually do with OLS. What are we looking for?
Greater than 1 and less than 1.
Greater than 1 and less than 1. Absolutely. And the standard errors.
Yeah.
So say I get a coefficient estimate of 0.99 and a standard error of 0.2. Okay, then will that variable be statistically significant?
Yes. Right. 0.99.
0.99, and I have a standard error of 2.
You said 0.2. I swear you said 0.2.
Okay, fine.
We'll see the recording later.
Yeah. Still, 0.2. The coefficient estimate is 0.99.
Yeah.
And my standard error is 0.2. How far away is 0.99 from 1?
0.9 and 0.00. I see. 0.01. Yeah.
So what is it almost?
I mean 1%. 1%.
Don't make this harder than it is.
I
What is 0.99 almost?
1?
1! Yes, exactly, right? And I get a standard error of 0.2, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So, the standard error gives you a feel for how accurate your estimate is, right? So, it could be 0.2 below 0.99 or 0.2 above 0.99. Well, guess what's right here?
1.
1. So, will that variable be statistically significant?
No.
No.
Oh.
Got it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is how these odd ratios are going to be interpreted. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Don't look at the ones, models 2, 3, or 4. Stands support EPA regulation of CO2. So, economic outlook. Remember, the reference category is much worse, right?
Yeah.
So compared to much worse, if you answer somewhat worse, are you more likely to support EPA regulation of CO2?
Yes.
Yes. If you're not sure, are you more likely to support EPA regulation of CO2?
Yes.
Yes. Why? From these models.
Because you feel better about the economy.
No, just numbers. Are they greater than 1?
I didn't know you look right. Yes.
Yes. Okay, very good. Next. About the same compared to someone who feels the economy is much worse. Are you more likely to support EPA regulation of CO2?
Yes.
Yes. Somewhat better. Are you more likely to support EPA regulation of CO2?
Yes.
Did I say somewhat better or much better?
Either.
Either.
Yeah, I can't remember.
They're both
They're all
statistically
the same.
significant. Right? So the point is, as someone's economic outlook increases, does that increase the probability they'll support EPA regulation of CO2 or reduce it?
Increases.
Increase it. Okay, now the way you interpret these odds ratios is compared to someone who answered much worse,
Yeah.
someone who answers somewhat worse is 1.384 times more likely to answer yes to supporting EPA regulation of CO2 than someone who answered much worse.
That's kind of handy, actually. That's easy
Well,
to interpret once you understand it.
Yeah, it is easy to interpret once you understand it, but someone who understands it have to explain it to you, and that's what I just did.
Okay.
Okay, so look at someone who thinks the economy will do much better, or is doing much better. How many times more likely are they to answer yes to I support EPA regulation of CO2 than someone who answered the economy is doing much worse?
6 times.
6 times. Yeah. So are all these economic variables statistically significant?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so let's stay in the first column, students. Let's look at their control variables. Moderate, conservative. They explain in the article what the omitted category is. Michael, just looking at it, what is the omitted category?
Which one? I was looking at my notes.
Political ideology.
Political ideology.
We have moderate and conservative, so what's the omitted?
Liberal.
Liberal, right. So liberal is the reference category or the omitted category, right? And so compared to liberals, are moderates less likely to support EPA regulation of CO2 emissions?
Yes.
Yes, right?
Yeah.
Are conservatives less likely to support regulation of CO2 emissions?
Yes.
Yep. So out of liberals, moderates, and conservatives, which group is least likely to support EPA regulation of CO2 emissions?
Conservatives.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay, and we have household income. It's kind of interesting. It's household income increases, reduces, but they already have the perception of the economy. So apparently, perception of the economy is more important than how much money you're actually earning. Perceptions are interesting things, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Education in this model, no effect. Age, the older you get, what effect does that have on the probability you will answer the EPA should regulate CO2 emissions?
It decreases.
Decreases. Probability you will answer yes to that. Correct. If you have been born again.
Baptized?
How is that possible? To be born again. Anyway, I won't get scriptural on you. It means, have you been born again? They ask people. It's meant to capture evangelicals.
Really?
Yeah, it's meant to capture evangelicals. So if you have been born again, are you more or less likely to support EPA regulation of CO2 emissions?
Less likely.
Less likely. Why do you suppose that is?
Because they're evangelical.
Well, they're evangelical. Again, this has been a fascinating research question for sociologists, for political scientists, but I basically think it boils down to, they think Christ will come again and the earth will be destroyed, and
so let's trash it now because it'll be destroyed anyway.
Yeah, I just read the data, right? All right. So minority, not statistically significant. We have Midwest, South, West. What's the omitted category? North, exactly. And it says that in the paper. So, compared to the North, are all the regions more or less likely to support EPA regulation of CO2? Less. Why do you suppose the North is more likely?
Even the West.
Yeah,
really?
Even the West. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Keep in mind, a lot of people out West are, ranchers.
Why'd they lump California and Oregon into this? Because that would have been a lot different if you'd had them.
Oh, yeah. That's the left coast.
Yeah.
But each study's different. You bring up a great point. And California as a state is different. You have those that live along the coast and everyone else. It's kind of like...
Okay, and then where do we stop breaking it up?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I got you.
I used to say as a kid, either you live a drivable distance from the beach or you don't. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, okay. Republican, independent. What's the omitted category? What's the reference category?
Liberal.
No, this is not ideology. This is identification. Liberal was...
Democrat.
Democrat. There you go. So, compared to Democrats, are Republicans or independents more or less likely?
Less likely.
Less likely to support EPA regulating greenhouse gas emissions. Right. Then, just one more on the back page here. Rural. Again, this is just a straight dummy variable.
Yeah.
Either you lived in an area that was coded rural or you didn't. Right.
Yeah.
If you lived in a rural area, reduces the probability that you will answer yes to the question, do you support EPA regulation of CO2 emissions. Got it?
Yeah.
And then our pseudo R squared. We explained that the other day. Don't worry about the math behind it. Just know that it tries to do the same thing as R squared, but when you're using logit or probit, not OLS. R squared only really works with OLS. But pseudo R squared is trying to do the same thing. So they're explaining, their model explains about 22% of the variation in support for the EPA regulating CO2 emissions.
Oh.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions on that?
No.
Any questions on the paper?
No.
Okay, so this is a long paper. It's a good paper, but it's a long paper. And so just again, there are other 4 ways of measuring support for environmental policies. Were support for RPS, and that was something that I'm not super familiar with, honestly. And then another was support for fuel efficiency standards, and the 4th one was support for EPA regulation of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. Those were their 4 different dependent variables. So, since you guys just wrote an essay on secondary data analysis, why did they pick those 4 questions as their way of operationalizing support for environmental policies?
Because they had those measures already.
They had those measures already, right? It was a good data set, and they were interested in looking at people's perceptions of the economy and how it was doing, and their support for environmental regulations. They found that. The next big thing we looked at was gender, and females in general were more likely to support environmental policies. But they found, and again, I'm just going to kind of make this. I'm going to sum up a lot of their research in one handy-dandy graph for you here. So, Michael, what is this saying?
That when people have a low economic outlook, then there's a drastic difference between a chance whether females and males support EPA regulation of CO2. But when they have higher economic outlooks, there's really no difference in the chance. Yeah.
Outstanding. Have a wonderful day, guys. Take care, and I hope you guys are doing well. Bye-bye.